welcome also on behalf of my co-chair, Professor Roger Lewis, and the National History Center to this Washington History Seminar with David Painter on oil and world power. We're thrilled to have David from across town here, finally to talk about one of the subjects that he's been dealing with for some time. Let me just mention that next week we have our final seminar for the semester. John Pocock from Johns Hopkins University will talk about Edward Gibbon, Roman and British Empires, a study in compatibilities. Let me also mention an event that the center is running here later this week on December 2nd, Thursday, from 2 to 6. We're doing a workshop on democracy, new tools for the struggle with Oleg Kozlovsky, and Russian democracy or political activist and recipient of this year's Jan Razzi Democracy Award. Let me thank Schaefer, the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, for supporting this seminar very generously all semester long, and we hope in the future, and that's why I'm mentioning them every time. And also thank Miriam Cunningham and Alison Laliakov on my team, and Miriam, the Assistant Director of the National History Center, for helping to put this seminar in place. With that, let me turn to David, who is Professor of History and a member of the core faculty at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has been teaching at Georgetown since 1987, has served as Director of Graduate Studies in the History Department. He has taught at a variety of other institutions, including the Institut für Geschichte at the University of Vienna. And he has served as historian at the U.S. State Department as well, and was also a research fellow with the Congressional Research Service. His publications, most of you are familiar with them, include Oil and the American Century, The Political Economy of U.S. Foreign Policy, 1941 to 54. He's co-editor with Mel Leffler of The Origins of the Cold War, International History, and he has published articles on a wide variety of subjects, from oil and foreign policy to U.S. policy towards the Third World. He currently is focused on a number of projects, including the 51 to 54 oil crisis, oil and the Cold War. He published an article in the Cambridge History of the Cold War on the subject, a study of the oilman Enrico Mattei, and the environmental impact of the U.S. military, which is a joint project with John McNeil at Georgetown. We're delighted to have him here today. Let me turn to Roger for any further thoughts of introduction. Otherwise, it's...
Well, my further thought of introduction would just simply be to point out that David Painter is a stalwart of the American Historical Association. For year after year, he can be depended upon to organize panels, to serve on committees, and to pursue the two themes of oil and the Cold War. And so this evening, we have a kind of convergence of the two preoccupations that David Painter has been concerned with for a long time.
Is there a stop? No. No. Okay.
5, 4, 3.
We do have a ritual that we go around and let everyone introduce himself, herself, with your institutional affiliation. So let's begin with the legal counsel for the American Historical Association.
Hi, I'm Albert Beveridge, Johns Hopkins University.
Miriam House Cunningham, the National History Center.
Liviu Tsirau, Woodrow Wilson Center. Helen Needell, Smithsonian Institution.
Sonia Michelle, Wilson Center.
Björn Hofmeister, PhD candidate at Georgetown University.
Anand Doprani, PhD candidate at Georgetown.
Gavin Wright, I'm a fellow at the center this year.
Sam Wells, Wilson Center.
Richard Keisel, Georgetown.
Noel Lafleur, I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center this year.
David Nichols, State Department.
Stevie Alper, Middle East Political Analyst, State Department.
Maria Pinto Carland, formerly with Georgetown University.
John Carlin, History Office, Department of State.
Holly Galley, Georgetown University and University of Texas.
Bill Burr, National Security Archive. Oh, sorry.
Mara Albrecht, Wilson Center.
Kara Coughlin, intern at the Wilson Center.
Pablo Leon, visiting researcher at Georgetown.
Regine Spector, visiting research scholar here at the Kennan Institute.
Roger Hardy, Wilson Center.
Kent Hughes, Global Energy Initiative, Wilson Center.
Bob Hathaway, Asia Program, Wilson Center, but more to the point, a graduate student with David back in the 1970s, so I can tell you the real stories.
Richard Eiserman, Woodrow Wilson Center.
Stapleton Roy, Kissinger Institute Director, Wilson Center.
Thank you.
Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center.
David Darlington, American Historical Association.
James Sang, IBM retired.
Carol Sang, historian, independent scholar.
Tom Dell, former DOD.
Charter and freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland.
And I'm Don Doyle from the University of South Carolina and public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Well, a warm welcome to all of you, and David, you have the floor.
Okay, first I want to thank the National History Center and the Wilson Center, and especially Roger Lewis, for inviting me to participate in this seminar. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, I'm going to try to read this and keep it on time. I've got my timer here, and try to get it done so we'll have time for questions. My main argument is that oil was the heart of world power in the 20th century and that its influence shows no sign of diminishing in the 21st. As Daniel Yergin pointed out in his 1991 Pulitzer Prize-winning study, The Prize, oil has been, quote, an essential element in national power, a major factor in world economics, a critical focus for war and conflict, and a decisive force in international affairs.
David, the microphone, we need
to get a little closer. Okay.
Hard to understand.
Yeah. Despite oil's obvious importance, there are only a handful of studies that explore its impact on the history of the 20th century. Moreover, most historians of international relations neglect oil. Yergin focuses on oil as a commodity intimately intertwined with national strategies and global power and politics, and his emphasis on the strategic importance of oil during the period from World War I through World War II sets the prize apart from most other studies of the oil industry. But this aspect of his analysis begins to fade after World War II and disappears almost completely after 1956. As for studies of international relations, let me give you two examples. Although Paul Kennedy focuses on the importance of economic factors in international relations in his best-selling Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, he does not examine the role of oil in economic change and military conflict. Likewise, despite the fact that oil in the Middle East were central to almost all the major post-war doctrines of U.S. foreign policy, the Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, and Carter doctrines, John Lewis Gaddis barely mentions oil in his popular survey, Strategies of Containment. As noted, I'm working on a book on oil and world power from the early 20th century to around 2003. Just thought I'd pick 2003. It's an interesting date. My study draws on my background as an international historian and my previous and current research on international oil, the international history of the Cold War, and U.S. relations with the Third World. It is based on secondary sources, from a wide variety of fields: international history, regional history, political history, economic history, business history, military history, energy history, and a wide range of primary sources, including foreign relations in the United States, U.S. National Archives, Library of Congress, presidential libraries, from Roosevelt to Reagan, and Reagan Library finally declassified some documents 2 years later. The United Kingdom National Archives, most of you probably know, is the Public Record Office, the British Petroleum Archives at the University of Warwick, and the papers of oil consultant Walter Levy at the University of Wyoming. And, you know, such online documentary collections as the Digital National Security Archive and the CIA's collection of declassified documents have also been useful. I might mention that the CIA electronic reading room has a lot of documents, but the worst search engine I have ever seen. You get different finds every time you use it. Now, one of the main arguments of the book and the focus of my talk today is the control of oil has been a key element in U.S. wealth and power since the early 20th century. Because oil was central to military power and industrial society, possession of ample domestic supplies and control over access to foreign oil reserves have been significant and often overlooked elements in the power position of the United States relative to its rivals. Before discussing oil's role in establishing and maintaining U.S. preeminence in the international system, I want to review briefly oil's military and economic importance. During the first half of the 20th century, oil became central to military power. Just before World War I, the navies of the great powers, led by the Great Britain and the United States, began to switch from coal to oil as a fuel, and this made access to oil an important security issue. Although the surface fleets of the great powers played a relatively minor role in the fighting, the major military innovations of World War I, the submarine, the airplane, the tank, and motorized transport, were all oil-powered. In addition, oil carved out a role in the manufacture of munitions when the British, using a process developed by Royal Dutch Shell, began extracting toluene, an essential ingredients in the explosive TNT, from oil. Oil was crucial in the origins and outcome of World War II. Control of the oil resources of the Caucasus was an important element in German leader Adolf Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. Similarly, Japan was dependent on the United States for 80% of its oil needs in the early 1940s. And the U.S. decision to cut off oil exports to Japan in the summer of 1941 forced Japanese leaders to choose between going to war to seize oil supplies in the Netherlands East Indies or giving in to U.S. pressure, and thus led directly to the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in December 1941. All the key weapon systems of World War II were oil-powered. Surface warships, including aircraft carriers, submarines, airplanes, including long-range bombers, tanks, and a large portion of sea and land transport. Oil continued to play an important role in the manufacture of munitions, and the development of petroleum-based synthetic rubber helped relieve Allied dependence on Southeast Asian natural rubber supplies, most of which were in the hands of the Japanese for most of the war. Access to ample supplies of oil was a significant source of Allied strength, while German and Japanese failure to gain secure access to oil was an important factor in their defeat. Despite the development of nuclear weapons and later ballistic missiles, oil-powered forces remain vital to military power. Except for nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines, most of the world's warships remained oil-powered, as did aircraft, armor, and transport. In addition, each new generation of weapons consumed more oil than its predecessors. The war's major post-World War II wars, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, several wars in the Persian Gulf, have been fought with conventional, largely oil-consuming weapons, and they demonstrate the continuing centrality of oil-powered forces and hence oil to military power. In addition, during the 20th century, oil became an integral part of modern economic life. A versatile fuel that combines high energy density and easy transportability, oil became the fuel of choice in land and sea transport, as well as the only fuel for air transport, and challenged coal as the main energy source for energy. Oil has played an important, if somewhat less crucial role in heating and electricity generation. However, oil-powered machinery has become crucial to modern agriculture, and oil has become an important feedstock for fertilizers and pesticides. Indeed, with the development of the petrochemical industry, oil has reached into almost every area of modern life. Already almost a fifth of U.S. energy consumption by 1925, oil accounted for around 1/3 of U.S. energy use by World War II. Outside the United States, in contrast, oil was a secondary fuel reserved mainly for transport and military uses, and accounted for less than 10% of energy consumption in Western Europe and Japan before World War II. However, after World War II, oil's economic importance increased as the United States intensified its embrace of patterns of socioeconomic organization premised on high levels of oil use, and Western Europe and Japan made the transition from coal to oil as their main energy source. By 1973, just pick that date out, oil accounted for 47% of U.S. energy consumption, 64% of West European energy consumption, and 80% of Japanese energy consumption. After a pause due to the oil crises of the 1970s, world oil demand resumed its growth in the 1990s due to structures of consumption already in place in developed countries, especially in the United States, and economic growth in the developing world, especially in Asia and within Asia, China, and India. By the end of the 20th century, oil accounted for around 40% of global energy consumption, including over 90% of transportation energy use, and was the most important commodity in international trade, both in terms of volume and in terms of value. Now hopefully this brief overview of the military and economic importance of oil will help set the stage for understanding oil's role in world power. Now, one of the features of world oil geography has been that with two exceptions, the United States and the Soviet Union, none of the great powers possess significant oil reserves within their borders. Now, as I said at the beginning, the focus of my argument today is that possession of ample domestic oil supplies and influence over access to foreign oil reserves have been essential elements in the power position of the United States. The United States was the world's leading oil producer for the first 3/4 of the 20th century. It yielded the top spot to the Soviet Union in 1977 and dropped to number 3 behind Saudi Arabia and Russia in the 1990s, but still number 3. U.S. fields accounted for slightly less than 2/3 of world oil production in 1920, slightly more than 2/3 in 1945, down to 16.5% in 1973, and 8% by 2003. In addition to being blessed with a thriving and productive domestic oil industry, 5 of the 7 great oil corporations, the so-called Seven Sisters, the companies that dominated the international oil industry from the 1920s to the 1970s, were American companies. U.S. companies, along with British firms, well, actually British firm and a British-Dutch firm, Shell, dominated the oil industries of the 2 main producing countries in Latin America, Mexico until 1938, and Venezuela, and had smaller holdings throughout the region. And during the 1920s and early 1930s, the U.S. government successfully supported efforts by U.S. oil companies to gain concessions in the Middle East. U.S. oil companies were also involved in regionally significant oil fields in the Netherlands, East Indies. By the eve of World War II, U.S. companies accounted for nearly 40% of oil production outside the United States and the Soviet Union. So in general, the U.S. has got about 2/3 of consumption in general, and then outside the U.S. controls 40%. Now, adding to this domestic power pace, the United States consolidated its control of world oil in the decade following World War II. By the mid-1950s, U.S. companies were firmly entrenched in the great oil-producing areas outside the Soviet Union. More importantly, however, the United States possessed the means to ensure the stability of producing regions and the means to gain access to their oil. The U.S. Navy emerged from World War I the equal of the Royal Navy, thus providing the United States with the capability of securing access to overseas oil-producing areas. Now, the U.S. was already firmly entrenched in the oil-rich Gulf of Mexico Caribbean region before World War I for security regions that antedated oil's emergence as a strategic commodity. World War II and the Cold War reinforced this traditional U.S. determination to maintain an economic and strategic sphere of influence in Latin America. Securing the Persian Gulf region, which became the center of the world oil industry following World War II, really during the 50s and 60s, was more difficult for several reasons, including the region's distance from the United States, the involvement of rival great powers, and the dynamics of regional politics. Great Britain had emerged as the leading power in the Middle East following World War I. Following World War II, the United States gradually assumed Britain's role as the main guarantor of Western interests in the Persian Gulf, a role it formally adopted with the announcement of the Carter Doctrine in January 1980. In addition, there was a symbiotic relationship between U.S. global strategy and oil. Following World War II, the United States adopted what people called a maritime strategy of maintaining access to economically vital overseas areas, including overseas sources of vital raw materials such as oil. As part of this strategy, the United States established a vast archipelago of overseas military bases that allowed it to project its power into almost every region of the world. The strategic forces, air and sea power, necessary for this strategy could and were used to maintain access to overseas oil reserves. Now, these forces were also dependent on oil, and the U.S. military became the largest single user of petroleum products in the world. In addition to being a tremendous military asset, access to ample supplies of oil provided the United States with important advantages in the industrial transformation of the first half of the 20th century. Cheap and plentiful supplies of oil were a prerequisite for the automobile industry, which played a central role in the U.S. economy from the 1920s to the 1960s. This is something that's really difficult to explain to students today, that the U.S. was once a major automobile producer. But I think most people here realize that. The availability of inexpensive oil led the United States to reshape its society and economy in ways that guaranteed a large and growing demand for oil. Now, how did control of oil contribute to U.S. preeminence in the international system? Let me give some examples, and I apologize if these are really short. I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here. Shortly before World War I, as I mentioned earlier, the United States and Great Britain began converting their main battle fleets from coal to oil. Oil provided numerous advantages over coal. In addition to greater speed and range, oil-fueled ships were much easier to refuel. While Britain possessed immense reserves of top-quality steam coal, it had almost no indigenous oil reserves. In addition, despite the size of its empire, oil production empire was only a small fraction of world oil production. Thus, the shift to oil presented Britain with serious problems of maintaining access to oil. The United States, in contrast, possessed extensive domestic oil reserves. In addition to its other advantages, oil also promised to solve the U.S. Navy's problem of projecting its power into the Pacific. It was difficult and expensive to establish and supply coaling stations in the Pacific, since coal had to come either from Wales or Appalachia. Western U.S. coal was unsuitable for use in marine steam engines. But oil made it possible for the United States to become a Pacific power. During World War I, oil and internal combustion engine heralded a revolution in mobility on land, sea, and in the air, and oil became an important source of U.S. power and influence. By the last year of the war, the United States was supplying more than 80% of Allied oil requirements, and the American Navy was playing a key role in supplying and protecting tanker transport of oil to Europe. Now, oil was also an important, I think, generally overlooked factor in the interwar balance of power. As I said earlier, the Soviet Union was the only other great power with significant oil reserves within its borders. The Russian Empire, in fact, had briefly been the world's leading producer around 1900, accounting for about half of world production. Soon thereafter, political problems, war, revolution, civil war, caused output to drop fairly sharply. But it did recover in the 1920s, and by 1939, the Soviet Union was again the second largest oil producer in the world, far behind the United States and slightly ahead of Venezuela. While the Soviets faced many strategic challenges, access to oil was not one of them. The other great powers, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, and here I follow Paul Kennedy, I'm not including Italy, the other great powers lacked indigenous oil reserves and were therefore dependent on foreign sources. Efforts to promote oil development in the British Empire failed to produce results. And although British companies held concessions in Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia, maintaining access to this oil required stability in the oil-producing areas and control of the sea routes linking the oil-producing areas to Britain. If the Mediterranean were closed, a prospect that seemed increasingly likely as Britain's relative power declined in the 1930s, access to Middle East oil would be very difficult. Assuming that the oil fields and other facilities could be defended. Production in the Far East was not great, and access to its oil would be even more difficult to defend in wartime. Wartime access to Western Hemisphere oil would be dependent on the acquiescence and probably the assistance of the United States, to which Britain had conceded regional supremacy shortly after 1900, and whose help would be needed to transport the oil safely across the Atlantic. This dependence on the United States for vital oil supplies was a critical weakness in Great Britain's power position, one that you can find they recognize in the documents at the time, but one that many scholars still ignore. France had almost no indigenous oil production, and France's stake in foreign oil was largely limited to a share in Iraqi oil production and holdings in Romania and Galicia. Access to Iraq, which by 1939 supplied almost half of France's oil imports, was dependent on British assistance to keep the Mediterranean open and the Middle East secure. Romania was able to fill only a small portion of French oil requirements, and access to Romanian oil would be unreliable in the event of a conflict with Germany. Production in Galicia, which had been the third leading producer in 1909, plummeted after World War I and never recovered. Access to Western Hemisphere oil, the other source of French imports, was dependent on U.S. goodwill and assistance. France was thus doubly dependent, needing both British and U.S. cooperation to ensure access to oil. Germany and Japan had very little indigenous oil production, and German and Japanese oil companies have been shut out of the major foreign oil-producing areas, leaving both nations dependent on foreign companies for necessary supplies, and thus vulnerable to economic and political pressure. Moreover, British and U.S. control of the oil-producing areas and Anglo-American command of the sea routes to these regions threatened their access to oil in the Middle East and the Western Hemisphere. Convinced that oil was essential to fuel his ambitions, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler moved to promote the development of synthetic fuel industry in Germany shortly after taking power in 1933. By the outbreak of World War II, coal-derived synthetic fuels accounted for around 46% of Germany's peacetime oil needs. However, the process of extracting oil from coal is complicated and expensive, and the huge installations required massive amounts of steel and were very vulnerable to air attack. Although Germany gained assured access to Romanian oil in November 1940, when Romania was forced to adhere to the tripartite pact, Romanian production was not sufficient to meet Germany's needs. Therefore, the lack of access to oil that did not depend on sea routes subject to interdiction by enemies remained an important strategic liability for the Germans. Japan developed shale oil in Manchuria, but production was small, really minuscule actually, and very costly, leaving Japan dependent on the United States for around 80% of its oil needs. Most of the rest came from the Netherlands East Indies, which possessed the largest reserves in East Asia. Control over the oil of the Netherlands East Indies could go a long way toward meeting Japan's oil needs. On the other hand, seizing the NEI could lead to conflict with Great Britain and the United States. In contrast, the United States strengthened its position as the world's leading oil producer during the interwar period. After a brief oil scare following World War I, the growth in U.S. reserves outstripped demand for the rest of the 1920s as new fields were found in California and Oklahoma. The discovery of the great East Texas oil field in 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression, made overproduction rather than scarcity the key issue facing the U.S. oil industry. The U.S. entered World War II with a surplus production capacity of over 1 million barrels a day, about 30% of U.S. production in 1941. World War II marked the apogee of oil's direct military importance, and the role of oil-powered weapon systems demonstrated that oil had become the lifeblood of the modern military machine. The U.S. oil industry almost single-handedly was able to fuel not only its own war effort, but also that of its allies, once the logistics of transporting the oil safely across the Atlantic had been mastered. Again, about 80% of Allied oil comes from the United States. In addition, U.S. leadership in oil refining technology provided the U.S. military with such advantages as 100-octane aviation gasoline, which really helps airplane performance, and specialty lubricants needed for high-performance aircraft engines. Soviet Union also benefited from having indigenous oil supplies. They were able to retain control of the vital Caucasian oil fields and rush new fields in the Volga-Urals region, safely removed from the fighting into production. These successes helped Soviet forces attain the mobility necessary to repel the German invaders and to go on the offensive. On the other hand, damage, disruption, overuse, transportation problems, equipment shortages, and competing priorities led to a sharp decline in Soviet oil production during World War II, and by 1945 the Soviet Union had dropped back to third place after the United States and Venezuela in world oil production. During the Cold War, control of oil helped the United States contain the Soviet Union, end destructive political, economic, and military competition among the core capitalist states, mitigate class conflict within the capitalist core by promoting economic growth, and retain access to the raw materials, markets, and labor of the periphery in an era of decolonization and national liberation. Now, U.S. leaders saw economic growth in Western Europe as central to the containment of Soviet power and influence. Soviet expansion into Eastern and Central Europe as a result of World War II left the Soviets in control of almost all of Europe's known indigenous oil reserves, as well as important sources of coal in Poland and the Soviet zone of Germany. Making matters worse, post-war Western Europe faced a coal shortage of alarming proportions owing to wartime overproduction and destruction, as well as post-war food, transportation, and other problems. To fuel economic recovery and to prevent Western Europe from becoming dependent on the Soviets for energy, the United States sought to ensure that this critical area received the oil it needed. Around 10% of Marshall Plan aid was spent on oil from U.S. oil companies. This aid helped spur economic growth in Western Europe and preserve market for those U.S. companies. Economic growth and prosperity undercut the appeal of leftist parties, financed the welfare state, perpetuated the ascendancy of moderate elites, and sustained the cohesion of the Western alliance. And also, by controlling access to essential oil supplies, the United States was able to reconcile its aims of German and Japanese economic recovery and integration into a Western alliance with the other aim of preventing the reoccurrence of German and Japanese aggression. The U.S. commitment to rebuilding the world economy, along with concerns about the long-term adequacy of U.S. domestic supplies, deeply affected U.S. policy toward Latin America and the Middle East, the two main producing areas outside of North America and the Soviet Union. In addition, the United States utilized private oil corporations to protect and promote the national interest in foreign oil. Reliance on private companies as vehicles of the national interest in oil required the United States to combat economic nationalism and to try to maintain an international environment in which private companies could operate with security and profit, in effect supporting private control of the world's oil. Now, while the U.S. and Britain shared the goal of maintaining Western control of Middle East oil, how to deal with nationalism divided the two powers. U.S. policymakers favored a strategy of co-opting nationalists by meeting their demands for a greater share in the revenues generated by the oil industry, as long as these demands did not threaten Western access and control. The British, whose balance of payments and position as a great power were much more directly dependent on Middle East oil, distrusted nationalists and resisted nationalist demands for a greater share in oil revenues. These divergent approaches shaped U.S. and British responses to the Iranian nationalization of the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in the spring of 1951. Now, Anglo-Iranian's operations in Iran were Britain's most valuable overseas asset. And the British feared that if Iran succeeded in taking over the company, all of British overseas investments would be jeopardized. Now, U.S. policymakers shared British concerns about the impact of nationalization on foreign investment, but they feared that the British tried to use force to reverse nationalization. This could result in turmoil in Iran, could undercut the position of the Shah, boost the prospects of the pro-Soviet Tudeh party in Iran, and might even result in Soviet intervention. Moreover, the crisis broke out in the midst of the Korean War, making U.S. policymakers extremely reluctant to risk confrontation. Therefore, the U.S. urged the British to try to reach a negotiated settlement that preserved as much of their position as possible. U.S. efforts to mediate a settlement failed, however, as did attempts to convince the Shah to remove nationalist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. By 1953, the oil boycott that the British had put in place had sharply reduced Iran's export earnings, decimated government revenues. In addition, British and U.S. involvement in Iranian internal affairs had exacerbated the polarization of Iranian politics. Finally, the end of the Korean War and the completion of the U.S. military buildup allowed a more aggressive policy toward Iran. Fearing that Mossadegh might displace the Shah and that Tudeh influence was increasing, the United States and Britain organized, financed, and directed a coup that removed Mossadegh and installed a government willing to reach an oil settlement on Western terms. Take a break here. Next thing I'm going to talk about is the Suez Crisis, and anybody's ever worked on Suez, you can get in, but it's hard to get out. There's so much going on with the Suez Crisis, so I'll try to say as little as possible since it's The angle I'm approaching it from is during the Suez Crisis, the U.S. was able to use its strong position in world oil to minimize the damage to Western interests in the Middle East caused by British, French, and Israeli aggression. In July 1956, Egyptian nationalist leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the British and French-owned Suez Canal Company. Suez Canal was an important symbol of the Western presence in the Middle East and a major artery of international trade. 2/3 of the oil that went from the Persian Gulf to Western Europe traveled through the canal. Viewing Nasser's action as an intolerable challenge to their position in the region, the British, together with the French, who resented Nasser's support for the Algerian Revolution, and the Israelis, whose access to Persian Gulf oil was threatened by Egyptian control of the Straits of Tiran, developed, I think it's fair to call it, a very complex scheme to recapture control of the canal and topple Nasser through military action. The plan, which they put into action in late October, depended on U.S. acquiescence and U.S. cooperation in supplying them with oil if the canal were closed. The Egyptians closed the canal. They sunk ships in it and closed it down. Saudi Arabia and other Arab producers embargoed oil shipments to Britain and France, and Syria shut down the oil pipeline from Iraq to the Mediterranean. Incensed by his allies' deception, concern about the impact of their actions on the Western position in the Middle East, and embarrassed by the timing of the attack just before the U.S. presidential election in the midst of the Soviet suppression of the Hungarian revolt, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to implement plans to provide Western Europe with oil. And it's a great quote in the Foreign Relations series. He said, "Let them boil in their own oil." He refused these plans that had been made to provide Western Europe with oil in case of a shutdown of the Suez Canal, blocked British attempts to stave off a run on the pound, and threatened to cut off economic aid to Israel. Pressure worked. And following the withdrawal of British and French forces, the U.S. government and the major oil companies cooperated to supply Europe with oil until the canal was reopened and oil shipments from the Middle East to Europe restored. Now, I've been talking about U.S. power. Now, you would say, well, what about the 1970s? What about the oil crises of the 1970s, which seemed to show that the U.S. was losing control of world oil? Now, let's take a look at that. Now, during the 70s, really around 1970, in fact, U.S. domestic oil production began to decline, forcing the United States to import ever-increasing amounts of oil to meet its energy needs. So this is the first time the U.S. is beginning to become directly dependent on foreign oil. And as the U.S. position declined, the Middle East share of world oil production rose from around 7% in 1950 to 40% in 1973. It's actually higher than the Persian Gulf share. That's actually higher in 73 than it is now. As the very low cost of producing Middle East oil concentrated production in a highly unstable area. And now, at the same time that the U.S. was becoming dependent on Middle East oil, on oil imports in general, war and revolution in the Middle East and the changing dynamics of the Cold War raised questions about the ability of the United States to maintain access to the oil of the Persian Gulf. From World War II to 1971, the U.S. had looked to Great Britain to play the leading role as a guardian of Western access to the oil resources of the Persian Gulf. 1968, however, the British government, with a great sense of timing right in the middle of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, informed the United States that they were planning to withdraw their military forces from positions east of Suez by the end of 1971. In response, well, actually, Johnson's response was, as you might expect, he said a few prime things. But in response, the United States looked to the Shah of Iran to take over the role of guardian of the Gulf. The Shah, his internal position perpetually unstable, was eager to assume this role, hoping to restore the power and prestige of ancient Persia. Now, here's the part that I think a lot of people miss. Now, there was actually a strategy to deal with this decline in U.S. production, the rise in importance of Middle East oil. U.S. officials believed that allowing prices to rise gradually and gradually ceding control over ownership through participation rather than nationalization, that by going gradually, this would avoid a cutoff of oil supplies and the use of oil as a political weapon. They hoped that accommodating producing countries would buy time until alternative sources of oil could be developed, thus lessening the leverage of Middle East oil producers. Although higher oil prices could feed inflation and slow economic growth, they could also stimulate increased investment and production, especially in such high-cost areas as Alaska, offshore fields, Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, and especially in the North Sea, making the West less dependent on Middle East oil. Higher prices could also encourage conservation and increased efficiency in oil use, and they can encourage increased utilization of alternative sources of energy, in particular coal and nuclear power. However, politics in the form of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and the 1978-79 Iranian Revolution intervened. In 1973, in response to U.S. aid to Israel, the Organization of Arab Oil Exporting Countries, OAPEC, not OPEC, it wasn't OPEC, it was OAPEC, which is Arab producers plus Syria and Egypt, organized an embargo of oil shipments to the United States and the Netherlands and a cutback in oil production that resulted in a quadrupling of oil prices. And then in 1979, the turmoil surrounding the Iranian Revolution, 78-79, disrupted oil supplies and oil markets and led to a furthering doubling of oil prices. Despite these problems, however, the United States was able to reassert its influence over world oil through a composite strategy that included permitting higher prices to induce more efficient use of oil, developing alternative sources of supply, those I mentioned, Alaska, the North Sea, Mexico, Gulf of Mexico, even China exported a little in the 70s, promoting alternative energy sources, especially coal and nuclear power, and taking a direct role in Persian Gulf security. And right after, in 1980, the United States established the so-called Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, which was dedicated to this mission of security in the Persian Gulf in 1980, and this became the U.S. Central Command in 1983. And this commitment to Persian Gulf security eventually involved the United States in 2 wars with Iraq. Okay, now that's pretty much, I'm not going to go into more recent stuff we can in the talks, but I want, the U.S. had this great position in World War, so did the Soviets. How come the Soviets weren't able to convert the Soviet Union was not able to convert its control of significant domestic oil resources into influence in international affairs outside of Eastern Europe? Now, the Soviet Union reemerged as a major producer and exporter of oil in the late 1950s, and in the 1960s began developing vast new oil fields in western Siberia. Oil exports to Eastern Europe was a major source of Soviet influence, but it also became a drain on Soviet resources and never succeeded in buying loyalty. Similarly, although Soviet oil exports to Cuba helped counter U.S. economic pressure on the Cuban Revolution, supplying oil to Cuba at subsidized prices became another drain on Soviet resources. So they were not able to use those resources to help them. And despite geographical proximity, extensive efforts, and widespread anti-Western sentiment in Iran and the Arab world, the Soviets were unable to dislodge the United States from the Persian Gulf. And then during the 1950s, this is something that have come on in the course of my research, the Soviets helped China develop its oil industry through extensive technical assistance, including training Chinese engineers and geologists. And during the 50s, supplied around half of China's oil needs by shipping large amounts of oil to China. However, this aid worked against the Soviets in the long run because just before the Sino-Soviet split, in fact, in September 1959, the Chinese found a major oil field, the Taichung oil field, in northeastern China, which enabled them to replace the oil they had been receiving from the Soviet Union and thus survive the cutoff of Soviet assistance. Now, the Soviets gained financially from higher oil prices in the 1970s, but the windfall revenues gave the illusion of continued viability to a system that was in serious trouble and thus diverted attention away from the need to reform. Moreover, the high cost of developing Siberian oil drained investment away from the rest of the economy. By the early 1980s, the energy share of total investment, including investment in transportation, mainly pipelines, and now remember the oil is coming from western Siberia. That's the definition of the middle of nowhere. So this total investment, energy share of total investment, including pipelines, become a key factor depressing economic growth and productivity. And the collapse of world oil prices in the mid-1980s thwarted plans by Soviet reformers to use the earnings from oil exports to ease the transition to a command economy from a command economy to a market economy, and thus contributed to the collapse of communism. Now, some conservative writers claim that the Reagan administration engineered the oil price collapse to bring about the collapse of communism and to win the Cold War. Now, even if this is what has happened, even if this is what happened, and it's very far from clear on the basis of available record that this is what actually happened, Gorbachev and the new generation of Soviet leaders that emerged in the 1980s had already concluded that the policies of their predecessors were counterproductive and that continued conflict threatened their goal of overcoming the disastrous legacy of Stalinism, reforming their economy, democratizing their politics, and revitalizing their society. Thus, rather than killing communism, which was already terminally ill, the collapse of oil prices precluded the possibility, granted a very slight possibility, of social democracy in the Soviet Union. Now, let me conclude by saying the history of oil illuminates, I think, a wide range of important issues central to understanding the history of the 20th century. In particular, it highlights the interrelationships among political, strategic, economic, technological, social, and environmental factors, and thus demonstrates the necessity of interdisciplinary analysis. Examining the role of oil and U.S. power in the 20th century also draws attention to the role of factors such as geography, natural resources, technology, and the history of international relations, factors that are often ignored in studies of international relations. Understanding how oil fueled American power is fundamental to understanding the sources and consequences of U.S. dominance. Although oil provided a key basis for U.S. power, it does not by itself explain U.S. hegemony. Accounts that neglect its role, however, are incomplete and therefore misleading. Thank you.
David, just to start the discussion, since one of your main themes has been the attempt by the United States to control the industry throughout the world, what happens when one of the oil-producing countries fails to cooperate? In other words, what about sanctions? And is there a historical generalization that you can draw about how effective sanctions actually have been from time to time? For example, in the case of Iran in the 1970s, it seems that despite the sanctions, the economy would bend but not break and made things worse.
You know, sanctions work, a lot of the impact of sanctions has to do with the overall world oil market. For example, in the 1950s, when the Iranians nationalized and their oil exports were cut off, that didn't really bother the world oil economy because production in other areas was ramped up. So, you know, sanctions would not work. By the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, however, world oil markets were really tight. It was very difficult. Demand had grown tremendously during the 1960s and had begun to catch up with productive capacity. Now, people at the time talked about running out of oil. What they were running out of was productive capacity, because all the investment had been going to the Middle East because it was lower prices. You invest where you can produce at the lowest cost. So a lot will depend on those things. You don't want to force a crisis if you need oil, and most economies need oil. You don't want to have a crisis when there are not alternative sources of supply. And that's why, the Iranians have had not a great deal of problem selling their oil. People need the oil. What they have had trouble in is getting the investment to maintain. You just don't stick a pipe in the ground and the oil comes up and that's all you have to do. You have to continue to maintain it, and over time, especially in the United States and other places, as fields grow older, it's cost more and more to get the oil out of them, and you need more and more sophisticated techniques. So when companies or countries try to opt out of the world oil industry, they can often find a market for the oil for a large amount of time. Finding the investment to come in and maintain it is a larger problem. So a lot of what happens has to do with the larger economic context. Is that?
Yes. Steve Galpern.
You argue that
could you wait for the and perhaps reintroduce yourself as the author of a new book.
I published a book last year called Money, Oil, and Empire in the Middle East, which David, in fact, just reviewed for the Journal of Interdisciplinary History. Thank you very much. I was just going to kind of muse whether you think that in the effort, you can think of Britain, the United States, the effort to control oil leads to a kind of maybe an imperial overreach, that where instead of oil being a source of power, it is the thing that undermines power in the end?
Well, two things on that. The United States, and I just threw a little, one sentence in this. The United States right now, as George W. Bush said, we're addicted to oil. And the United States set up its society and economy to run on cheap and inexpensive oil in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, but really in the 30s when we motorized our cities, because it was cheap and inexpensive. But now we have this infrastructure, of which we continue to develop it all the way into the 60s, and in some cases still do. We still build roads rather than other. This is a problem. We are stuck with structures of consumption premised on cheap, inexpensive, and secure access to oil, and oil is no longer inexpensive, and access can be a problem. So, some of the factors that produce the power are now cutting back, are limiting U.S. power. In terms of trying to maintain access to oil, that has caused problems. The U.S. had better luck than the British, partially because we didn't need it as much. We could, in fact, share a little bit more. Actually, the whole thing started in Venezuela in 43 and again in 48, 50-50 profit sharing. You share 50% of the profits with producing countries, and this was introduced in Saudi Arabia in 1950, and a lot of people say this is what causes the Iranians the British did not want to extend it to Iran, that this caused the Iranians to nationalize. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the 50-50 profit sharing was possible because the oil companies, when they paid more taxes to Saudi Arabia, took that off their U.S. income tax as a credit. So it didn't really cost them anything. It cost the U.S. Treasury, but we didn't need it. The British, one, needed the money, and two, the tax code until later didn't allow companies to do that. So, the British are actually, and as you point out very nicely in your book, the British position as a world power, and especially the position of the pound sterling as a world currency, is really predicated on the profits, the super profits, that the British make from Middle East oil, first Iran, and then increasingly over the course of the 1950s, Kuwait. So, part of the way you do that is dependent on how much you need it. Now, the U.S., as anybody who studied U.S. diplomatic history, Sam Wells made us read, I don't think he agreed with, but made us read William Appleman Williams and the open door interpretation. It's been very good at informal empire versus the British more formal empire. And, that's worked fairly well, trying to identify groups and other countries that share our interests. I mean, actually, the British did this quite well in Latin America in the 19th century and other places as well. It didn't work as well as time went on. So, you look in the Middle East, who have we worked with? As we all were taught over and over again by Reagan and then by Bush, the U.S. promotes democracy. So our allies in the Middle East are all the democratic countries, right? Saudi Arabia, Iran, Jordan, Kuwait, monarchies. You could say in the long run that's probably short-sighted, but it's been worked well for us since 1933, or certainly since 1945. The trouble with things working well for a long time is you don't prepare for when things change, and the longer you wait to adjust to change, the more difficult change becomes. I think the economists call that path dependence. You go down one path and you need to go down this path, and you just can't cut over. You got to come back. And so the longer you wait to adjust, the more difficult it is. And I think the U.S. Should have been clear a long time ago. We could not continue to live the way we were, and yet we moved from suburbs to exurbs. And not only, which are based on tremendous commuting times, tremendous energy use, And we also just, at the same time, with the housing prices, built up our financial system on it. So, yeah, being that dependent and not having greater control over something as important as energy has a lot of consequences.
Microphone.
Sorry. Okay, Sonia Michelle. You talk about, I mean, in retrospect, it seems clear that building our economy and building our infrastructure so heavily on petroleum on oil was a bad idea. Were there critics at the time, like in the 20s and 30s, who were warning about the consequences of that?
Yes and no. I mean, people at the time talked a lot about conservation. They didn't mean using less, they mean using oil more efficiently. And certainly the U.S. and the U.S. political system and the way we, the legal system around oil production was very wasteful. So people were concerned about that. You know, I mean, obviously, to a certain extent, the U.S. is going to use more oil than the Netherlands. Population distances, population density. So, you know, the motorization of the countryside was probably a good thing. Getting food, you know, and for the economy, getting agricultural products to market, moving people around. Motorizing the cities is a bad idea. It was a bad idea for the United States in the 30s. It's still a bad idea, you know, and it makes me sad when I go to Italy and you see the cars eating the cities. It also makes me sad when I almost run over on a sidewalk, but that's another thing. So, you know, it's really, people did understand, but, you know, the alternatives, the nice alternatives like streetcars and railroads weren't run by beneficent people. So, I mean, part of the problem was that, you know, it would have taken a larger public role and larger, you know, planning, and it just wasn't going to happen when. Why do you want to do all of this when oil is $1 a barrel? Now, you can see why they may have done it in the 30s. It becomes a little more difficult in the 1940s to see why people are doing this, and it becomes even more difficult as time goes on. Why do you keep on doing this? Part of it, I guess, is this whole idea that you need, you know, economic growth is important to mitigate social conflict. Part of it is just the, you know, the mythology of the oil industry. I know. James Forrestal once complained that if the U.S. lost access to Middle East oil, the American car industry would have to shift to 4-cylinder engines, as if this were a great tragedy. And this was a time when we were shifting from 6 to 8-cylinder engines, and we continued to do this. And it seems like, you know, what happens. I mean, not only do you get these what I call structures of consumption built into place, but you have economic interest in doing things a certain way, and it's a lot easier to continue to do them certain ways, and it's very difficult to account for the cost. I know several years ago, a guy, I think at Cato Institute, came up with what is the cost of a barrel of Middle East oil if you factor in all the U.S. forces to protect it, and he comes up with some high figure. And yes, that's true, but those forces are also used for other things. So you can't, you know, and oil and the, let's call it the American empire, American influence, are sort of interrelated, and they're not, you know, we don't have an empire just to have oil, but oil does help fuel the empire. And, you know, there's this relationship. These forces can be used for other things. The forces that we used in 1991 in the Gulf War came from Germany, where they had been fighting the Cold War. Now that the Cold War's over, they can go to the Middle East. So a lot of it is bound up in a larger context of U.S. power and influence.
Thank you. Ken?
Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center here. Now it looks like more and more of production is controlled by national companies. 80%. And increasingly, national companies are also become major consumers. How do you see that affecting the path of?
You know, that's probably the thing that in the 1970s was probably the most important development that people sort of ignored. In 1968, OPEC passed a resolution to talk about moving toward participation, that countries would buy a share in the companies that were producing oil there. And that, they were going to go to 25 and gradually up to 51%. And during the 70s, when they got all this money with the oil crises, most places it was accelerated. So that at the beginning of the decade, I would say national companies control maybe less than 20% of world oil. By the end, it's almost 70%. Today, somewhere between 77 and 80% of world oil reserves, now not production reserves, are controlled by national companies. But that's pretty easy once you just add in Saudi Arabia. You got 25%, and some of the major producers. They still work fairly closely with the international companies. They still very tied into markets, and then in cases countries like Kuwait probably had more money, now has more money invested in other things. But that was sort of the creeping thing that people said, oh, we overcame all of this in the 70s and the 80s, we came back. But that control over time, that could cause a problem. And I think, that was what people were worried about with Iraq in 1991, how much they would control, because as some people say, oil's as good as money. It is, in fact, money. And then you take that money and have more power, buy more weapons, have more power, get control of more oil. So I think that's a longer-term problem. So far, the major producers have not gotten to the spot or feel themselves in the position that they can use that for coercion. The oil crises of the 70s, the two big ones, especially the 73, 74, and then the smaller 78, 79, were not oil crises in the sense that OPEC, and that's where everybody, OPEC did this. No, OPEC didn't do this. The first one was due to the Arab-Israeli war. It had a specific regional political context. And the second one was due to the Iranian Revolution. It's very difficult for all these countries to act in concert because they're very different. I mean, what does Mexico have in common with, let's take up Russia? Probably a lot, but political system. But, it's very difficult. And then there are different cultures. That you have the whole problem of countries that have a large population and small production, and they need money now, versus countries have small population, large production. They have high absorbers and low absorbers. Saudi Arabia, interesting enough, used to be a low absorber, and now its population is so big it's sort of a high absorber. So it's not so much that they will get together and do something, but if there is another crisis, a political crisis, a war, revolution, something like that, intervenes, then those economic factors could lead to an oil crisis. But I don't see that happening just on the basis of the producing countries organizing themselves.
Thank you. We're here. Hi, David. This is a comment, not a question, so I'll be very brief.
Okay. John, could you identify yourself?
Oh, John Carlin, State Department History Office. One of the great might-have-beens of British imperial history is what would have happened had the British developed the Nigerian oil. Mm-hmm. My own research suggests that they're pretty close, 1907 to 1912, on the verge of finding it. They need more money, the companies involved. The Colonial Office have been giving them money, and decided in 1912 not to throw good money after bad, and so to stop. The exploration stops. It's not started again until the 30s, when they're on the verge of getting oil in commercial quantities. World War II breaks out, nothing happens. Commercial quantities come in the late 50s on the eve of independence. So it's always struck me as a very interesting question. If the British had developed this, there would have been a fairly secure supply of high-quality oil for the Navy.
Yes, I agree. When I was writing this paper I gave back in September, I dug through my files, and excavation would probably be a better, and found the copy of your article in International History Review. And it's a great story. The part of the problem was the company that was searching for it was owned by a German, and then he's killed in a car accident. And and I think this is a case where the British don't really call it good old boy, but you know what I mean, connections with the people who were in Iran, with Darcy and some of the people involved, and Anglo-Iranian, and override what would have been a wiser decision to get involved in Nigeria. Now, you say they were about 50 miles from where they eventually found a lot of oil, though it is at greater depths. It would have been a little more difficult and expensive, but I think technologically feasible. And that certainly is a lot closer to Western Europe. On the other hand, the British are already in the Middle East. They already are looking after the security and stability of the region because of the trade through Suez and the empire. India is still part of the empire. And so that's not seen as an extra cost, maintaining stability in the region. I mean, they're trying to maintain influence in Iran to keep the Russians out, coming down. And so I think they would still have been involved in the Middle East, though it would not have been as crucial. And obviously, it had a big impact later, after, Suez Canal might have been not as important once India's gone, except after World War II, oil becomes the major cargo going through. And interestingly, oil is a major cargo. Mainly it's going south to north, coming down the Gulf, up the Red Sea, to Europe. However, the Russians are sending oil the other way. They're sending oil to India. They're sending oil to China. And later, they're sending oil to North Vietnam. And when the Suez Canal is shut down in '56, it obviously hurts Western Europe. It also hurts the Russians because they're already stretching their tanker fleet, sending oil to China, because it's a long way. It's a really long way from the Black Sea to China. But it's even longer if you can't go through the Suez Canal. So, it's not the only thing going on, but it's a nice lens to look at international dynamics, economic, political. What I didn't get into here, and I probably will not get into enough in my book, tried to get into a little, and you can't avoid getting into it when you have a colleague like John McNeil, is the environmental impact of oil, which is, that's probably one of the most important impacts over time. Let's see,
hold on. We have a question over here, and Miriam, the microphone over there. Let me just, in the meantime, interject two questions, David.
Okay.
One is, to what extent did oil play a role in the internal Soviet reassessments under Gorbachev of the survivability of the Soviet economy, specifically oil? And of course, keeping in mind that after that under Putin, oil did give, and high oil prices did give Russian power another lease on life. And secondly, what was the role of oil in the decision-making leading up to 2003, since you had since you've mentioned this?
Okay. It's really fascinating to study the Soviet oil position in the 1980s. I don't read Russian. However, a colleague at Georgetown, Thane Gustafson, has written a marvelous book on this. I thought maybe he was working for some folks over in Virginia because of all the stuff he had access to, but maybe they were buying his stuff. But certainly between his book and I would say around 100 at least studies that the CIA has declassified on the Soviet oil industry in the 70s and 80s, you can see what's going on. And, it's sort of ironic that when the Soviet Union finally gets a government ready to reform, they no longer have the resources to do it. They had the money in the 70s and they didn't reform. In the 80s, Gorbachev comes in thinking he's going to use the oil revenues to do a soft landing. They can slowly, Gorbachev was a little unrealistic. He thought he could turn Russia into Scandinavia, but that's a noble goal. So I think it had a big impact. The problem was that they had gotten to the point, and the oil is in Western Siberia. Some of those fields are being overproduced. It's going to cost a lot of money to develop new fields, and you're moving further north and further east, which means the conditions are even more difficult, and the transportation costs are even higher. Now, it's not just oil. They're getting a lot of natural gas out, too. And, basically, the idea was you take these earnings, and then you could take that money and invest them in modernization of industry. Increasingly, what they would get the money and buy a pipeline, pipes. They would buy compressors. They would buy stuff to produce more oil. So the oil is the money is going back and forth. And between defense spending and energy spending, there's nothing left. You can pretty much explain why the Soviet economy doesn't go anywhere, because they're not investing in anything but oil and the military. Now, obviously, if you cut back the military, and which Gorbachev hoped to do, that would help. So that has, he doesn't really I don't know how much people really grasp, but that the cost of developing Siberian oil makes it, the societal cost, it may not be a net gain. The reason they're doing well now is they don't consume anywhere near as much because they don't produce much anymore. So I think it is a big factor. What I disagree with the conservative writers, I think the main one is Peter Schweitzer, who claims he cites all these documents, but he won't share them with anybody. And some of them are a little, that one, that the U.S. had this plan to drive down prices, and two, that's what drove down the prices. Whether or not they have the plan, and I don't know, the prices went down for a lot of other reasons besides that the U.S. talked to the Saudis about getting the prices down. The Saudis had their own reasons to break prices, and then there were a lot of other factors. I mean, prices had just gotten out of control. Until recently, real oil prices peaked, the highest real oil price was 1981. So they'd just gotten totally out of touch with supply and demand, mainly because people were nervous, political risk. On the second one, with the oil and oil factor in Iraq, I think you read the Cheney report talking about the need to develop foreign sources, especially, and most of those are going to have to be in the Persian Gulf. And if you're going to meet oil demand that they're projecting, you're going to have to double production in the Gulf, and you're going to double production in the Gulf. You're going to have to invest a lot more. Where is that investment going to come from? Are those countries themselves going to have the money, and do they have the incentive to do it? For a lot of producing countries, what's the point of producing more oil if it keeps the price down? Produce less, the price goes up. What they're interested in is the revenue. So that's the problem. And I tell my students that if they weren't thinking about oil, what were they thinking about? I mean, getting rid of Saddam Hussein gets rid of a major military threat to security of the Persian Gulf. It has the potential of opening up Iraqi production. Now, Iraq has the benefit, or a dubious benefit, but Iraq had been a negative swing producer. Iraq has a lot of undeveloped oil because from about the 20s to 1972, Iraq oil is controlled by the Iraq Petroleum Company, which is a consortium of British Petroleum, Shell, Exxon, Mobil, and the French company, CFP. And they have other sources of supply, so they keep Iraq down to make room for Saudi Arabia and other places. There's a famous testimony by head of Exxon when Libyan oil came in. Do we have room for Libyan oil? He says, yes, with Iraq down. And then after 72, when the Iraqis nationalized, then they were sort of shut out of world markets. So this is a way to get Iraqi oil back in world markets, which creates a lot more supply, will take the pressure off of price. And if the Iraqis, there were some hopes the Iraqis would privatize, they're not going to do that. But opening that up would put pressure on other producers to at least allow production sharing agreements to let Western companies in to increase production. So, the potential that it would help, would put more oil in international markets, lessen the pressure, make it more, getting more oil there to accommodate China, India, not much change in the United States, the pressures on markets, and that it would, would remove a, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait in 1990. I mean, this is a major pressure, and this is, of course, this gets back into the politics. One of the reasons we have troops in the region is to protect against Saddam Hussein and Iran, but then having major amounts of troops in the region also is what exacerbates problems with Saudi Arabia and what most of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and they are objecting to U.S. forces. So I'm not saying they did it to get access to the oil, and certainly they didn't get access to oil specifically for American companies, but it could have a big impact on the security of the region, future investment in the region, and on world oil markets. So, in that sense, it's part of the larger context that happens. And, the funny thing is that when the Iraqis first announced contracts, they were going to give these contracts to certain companies. They were going to give them to British Petroleum, Shell, Exxon Mobil, and CFP. Nobody here thought, well, yeah, that's right. Those are big oil companies, right? Well, CFP is now Total, sorry. total. Those are the companies that ran the Iraq Petroleum Company from the 1920s to 1972. So people in Iraq are saying, you're bringing the guys, the old team back in. Now, you know, the other reason that would have to do with oil is the U.S. and others were concerned that maybe French and Chinese and other companies, Russian, would get privileged access to oil, and that would interfere with world oil markets. So I think oil is an element. I think it's an essential element. It's not the one thing. It goes around with everything else. It fits in with concerns about weapons of mass destruction, power, instability. Is that
all right?
Roger Hardy, you've preempted my question on Iraq, so I'm not going to ask you about Iraq, whether it was really blood for oil, as the anti-war protesters claimed. But so let me just make a short comment instead that I used to work for quite a few years as a Middle East analyst with the BBC, and one of the things I used to do was to go around and talk to ancient oil men, one of whom was George McGee in his elegant home in Georgetown. That was great fun. And the brief comment I want to make to all you guys as historians is that I don't come across academic researchers who are aware of the BBC archive. BBC archive it does not advertise itself, but on the other hand, it is not closed to researchers who come with the right piece of paper. I researched, just to give you one example, the events in Iran that you've described, the overthrow of Mossadegh, which was what I went to talk to George McGee about. 85% of the material I found I needed, which was horse's mouth material from the British, Iranian, and American side, it was already there in the BBC archive.
This
I
is
topped
in
it in London, and I topped it up with a couple of interviews of my own. That was regime change 1950s style, as it seems to me now. The BBC archive is there. It goes back to the Second World War and beyond in some cases. It's a great resource. It's not fully computerized, but it's there.
That's really good to know about. I know one of the things I've worked for years. In fact, I worked for years on the Mossadegh period, and sort of went into a stone wall with the CIA. They were not going to let stuff out. And it got to a point, and probably made a bad decision, that until that happened, I wasn't going to get far enough to know what went on. I think that was probably a bad decision. But when you mention reading the BBC archives, one of the main sources that people use for the overthrow of Mossadegh is Kenneth Love, who was New York Times correspondent. And he actually wrote a paper in Princeton in 1960 and was put in, I think it was in Alan Dulles' papers at Princeton, and people used it and then got sued. But he was the main source because he was there and he saw everything. And, so I'm reading Kenneth Love. Everybody's reading Kenneth Love. I met Kenneth Love. We had a conference in Georgetown in 2003, the 50th anniversary of the overthrow. And he was a very nice man. He went on later to write a great book on Suez. And he explained that when he got to Iran, he's very new to the Middle East. He didn't speak Farsi. He didn't know much about what's going on in Iran. And everything that he knew that was going on was his driver, who was furnished to him by the U.S. Embassy. And when he would see something, the driver would say, oh, that's a pro-Shah demonstration, that's a Tuta, that's this. And all of a sudden, I thought, oh, geez, should have known this. And I would assume that the BBC guys there spoke Farsi and had local contact. That is one of the huge things that you find out, that sometimes that your primary sources, like a newspaper, that they don't know. But I'm glad to know about these BBC archives.
We have here two representatives, David Nichols from the State Department, Mel Leffler representing the CIA. They can tell us what the state of play is with the CIA volume on Iran and the oil question.
I never knew I represented the CIA volume.
Well, there's always a first time, Mel. You're revealed.
You've been out. I do not represent the CIA. I think many people know that
an effort to publish a new volume. I think many people know that there's an effort to publish a new volume dealing with 1953, and it's being negotiated between the State Department and the CIA. That's what I know.
To be more clear, Mel is on the advisory committee for the Historical Advisory Committee for the CIA.
David Nichols with the State Department. That's basically my understanding as well, is that this is a much discussed issue, and there's some real challenges to getting it out, but we're hopeful that if we keep pushing eventually.
Well, who was the guy, who was the joint historian in 2003?
Jamie Van Hook.
Okay, and at our conference in October of 2003, Jamie assured me that it was only a matter of months. You know, I guess it is months if we're getting up to 100 months, things like that. It's still only a matter of months. But, you know, this has been happening a long time. I mean, the original Foreign Relations volume on Iran, before they took all the stuff out, was in my file cabinet at the State Department. I just couldn't look at it because I was working on it independently. But it was, you know, it was actually typeset.
Right.
But I don't know what it said because I kept my eyes out of there. But been waiting a long time. I mean, we've been waiting for relations with Iran to improve before we turn this out. If that's what it's going to take.
But I have a question on a somewhat different subject, though, and that has to do with countries that are coming online as oil producers in the future, and how you talked about path dependency earlier, which I thought was very insightful. How savvy you think these countries will be compared to some of the older countries to some of the problems people talk about the oil curse with corruption. They talk about Dutch disease and the hollowing out of economies. Do you have any thoughts about that?
You know, it's interesting. The one country that does it right is Norway. They're way down in the line in reserves. They're producing a lot quickly. I don't know if that's such a great idea, but that's what they're doing, and they're putting it away. And oil prices, and for consumers in Norway, are among the highest in Europe. So they didn't take that. I mean, they're still doing some. If you've been to Stavanger, which is the oil city, that's begun to look a little bit like a suburban U.S. town. It doesn't look like the rest of Norway. But, yeah, you can do it right. What Brazil will do, I don't know. They found all this oil. They haven't produced that oil yet. And it's going to cost a lot of money to do it. What I think in terms of, countries coming on both as producers and consumers, there's a lot of countries in the world that need to consume more energy. Now, the world as a whole doesn't need to consume more energy. So some of the countries who are consuming a lot of energy need to consume less. And I saw a statistic the other day that some of the European Union and England are actually moving down, at least in their carbon emissions. We're not. And the potential for savings here are tremendous. So that's a constraint, for most people, maybe not for senators from oil-producing states in the United States, but that just producing more is not the solution. It could cause problems.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Last question over there.
Could you say something about the ebbing and flow, Alan Edel, Smithsonian, of the political influence of the oil companies relative to city planners or global interests or anything as over the course from the 20s or from the 20th century?
That's one of the challenges of doing international history is how you can also integrate national histories, and it's driving me nuts, or further in that direction. How you do that, I know, and was able in my first book, which was a much more focused on the U.S. policy in a certain time period, to see how the differences, say, between independent producers versus the international companies versus people, new dealers, and you could see the coalitions and how they formed and how, oil companies could, where the majors and independents could get, what types of issues they disagreed on, but what types of issues they could agree on. And generally, they could agree on more. Let's consume more, and if we consume more, you can meet the revenue needs of the small companies, and the big companies can import some oil and make a lot of money on imports, especially after 1959, when the U.S. puts a oil import quota, not a tariff, a quota, which maintains U.S. prices at a higher level than world prices for a while. That is difficult to do consistently over a project this large. I think generally you have to do what Deep Throat said, follow the money. What do people get together on? I think the companies have learned just to talk in general terms about economic growth, prosperity, jobs, and to put that in context of a favorable business environment. Don't put limits that will hurt us with jobs, and we will try to take care of things. Now, I would have thought that people might have stopped believing that after the disaster in the Gulf last spring. It didn't seem to calm people's demands for greater drilling in offshore areas. So, the influence of the companies is part of an overall influence of business, of private enterprise, of this in the United States, and they feed into that quite well. The thing that's a little interesting, especially if you go back to the period when Texas production was controlled by the Texas Railroad Commission, which is running a cartel. I mean, it's and they have a huge oil depletion allowance and all these subsidies, and they're so dependent on the U.S. They're really dependent on government power to maintain their profits. They are the loudest opposing government power, because not power, but if power of the government gets in the hands of the wrong people. So sometimes the people who yell the loudest about government intrusion into the market are the people who are gaining the most from it. And I think part of the reason is they're worried that if they lose control of the government, which is possible in a democracy, then that power could be used in ways that might hurt them rather than help them.
Since you mentioned BP, David, BP, as you know, has a history of great resilience, but are you still optimistic about the future of BP?
For years, oil industry people made fun of BP as an incompetent bunch who got by because they had the great luck of controlling Iran and half of Kuwait. And I know, the British used to, what is his name? Sir Eric Drake. He's on a lot of these documentaries whining about how they lost. They had 100% of Iran and they had to give up 60%, and they only got to keep 40%, and how the Americans mistreated them and all of this, and the Americans grabbed that from them, and leaving out the fact that, one, they didn't go from 100 to 40, they went from 0 to 40 because they'd been nationalized, and two, the settlement in Iran, they, in effect, reverse nationalization. The companies who got this 60% paid Anglo-Iranian for that 60%, and the overriding royalty that they got for 20 years was their major source of income for many years, and that's what they finally built their power and diversified their interest. And now they're a private company, even though I think the British government sold its shares at a particularly bad time for the government, but then that was Margaret Thatcher, and she didn't care. I mean, you read how much money they have in cash and all the different things they own. I'm not worried about them.
Okay, I think we'll have to close on that note.